The wind had no pity. It was a razor across the cracked earth, stripping the heat from the day and carrying the scent of dust and distant rain that would never fall here. It flayed the skin of the dying girl, her breath a shallow catch in a throat raw with thirst and sorrow. She was a daughter of the people, the NDE, but here, under the merciless glare of a white-hot sun, she was just a ghost in waiting. Her name was Nita, and it meant bear, a name given for a strength she could no longer feel. Her buckskin dress, once beautifully beaded by her mother's hands, was torn and stained with the blood of her family. They were ghosts now, too, their spirits scattered by the thunder of rifles and the greed of a man whose face was a mask of cold entitlement. She had run. She had run until her lungs were fire and her legs were lead. But the desert was an ocean and she was drowning in it. Every rock was an accuser, every cactus a sentinel watching her fail. The world had bled out into shimmering waves of heat, the turquoise sky turning a bruised and violent purple at its edges. She crawled, her fingers digging into the sharp gravel, a prayer to the earth mother dying on her lips. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the silhouette of a lone, weathered cabin on a distant rise, a mirage of safety in a world that had offered none. It was an impossible dream, a final cruelty of a mind starved of hope. Then, the darkness was absolute, a cold and silent blanket that promised an end to the pain. She had been a warrior's daughter, a sister, a keeper of stories. Now, she was nothing but a final, fading whisper on the uncaring wind. Have you ever wondered if a single moment, a single choice, can redeem a lifetime of pain? Can one act of compassion in a world of cruelty be enough to build a fortress against the coming storm? This is a story about that very question. It is the story of a man who had walled off his heart and a woman who had lost everything but her spirit, and how they found in each other a reason to fight against an unforgiving world. It is a testament to the fact that a home is not built with wood and nails, but with courage and kindness, and that love is the only true shelter from the winds of hatred. The man was Jedediah Stone. He was a creature of the frontier, carved from the same hard rock and weathered wood as his isolated homestead. His heart was a landscape as barren as the alkali flats that bordered his land, scoured clean of softness by a grief so profound it had become a part of his very bones. A wife and child, taken by a fever that had swept through their camp like a wildfire years ago, had left him with nothing but silence and the biting companionship of memory. He had retreated into this self-imposed exile, his only conversations held with the wind and the hawks that circled overhead. He saw her from the ridge line, a crumpled heap of brown and black against the pale dirt, less a person and more a piece of discarded refuse. His first instinct, honed by years of solitude and caution, was to turn his horse and ride away. She was not his problem. The world was full of sorrows, and he had his own to carry. But as he drew closer, he saw the fall of her long black hair, the slimness of a form that spoke not of threat, but of terrible vulnerability. He saw the stillness that was not peace, but the prelude to death. And something inside him, a shard of the honorable man he had once been, refused to let him leave her to the coyotes and the sun. He dismounted, his movements stiff and reluctant, and knelt beside her. An Apache girl. This land had seen enough blood between his people and hers. But looking at her face, serene in its unconsciousness, he saw not an enemy, but a child of God, abandoned and broken. With a sigh that seemed to tear from the deepest part of his soul, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a fragile thing of bone and spirit. As he carried her toward the cabin that was his prison and his sanctuary, he did not know that he was carrying his own redemption. The cabin was a testament to Jedediah's solitary existence. It was stark, clean, and functional, a place stripped of all comfort and decoration. A stone hearth, a narrow cot, a rough-hewn table, and a single chair were its only furnishings. It smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and a deep, abiding loneliness. Into this world of gray he brought her. He laid Nita gently on his own cot, the only soft place in the entire structure, and for a moment he simply stood there, a man utterly lost. He was skilled in the arts of survival. He could track a deer for days, build a fire in a downpour, and defend his land with a rifle. But the quiet art of nursing, of tending to another living soul, was a language he had long forgotten. The memories it evoked were ghosts with sharp edges. He remembered bathing his own daughter's feverish brow, his wife's hand cool on his as they prayed through the night. The memory was a physical blow, and he flinched from it, his face hardening into its familiar stoic mask. But the girl's shallow breathing was a persistent call to the present. He pushed the ghosts away, focusing on the task. He fetched clean water from the well, his movements precise and economical. With a rag, he began to gently clean the grime and dried blood from her face. Her skin was the color of warm copper, and even in her state, there was a delicacy to her features, a high arch of cheekbone and a proud set to her jaw. He found the wound in her side, a ragged tear from a bullet that had grazed her ribs. It was ugly but not fatal if infection didn't take root. He cleaned it with whiskey, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man with such calloused hands. She moaned, a low, wounded sound, but did not wake. He bandaged the wound with strips torn from one of his own clean shirts. For hours, he worked in silence, tending to her, forcing spoonfuls of cool water between her cracked lips. The sun set, and he lit a single lantern, its golden light pushing back the shadows, creating a small, intimate circle of warmth in the vast, dark wilderness. He sat in the lone chair, watching her breathe, the rifle resting across his lap. He was a guardian, a role he had never expected to play again. The silence in the cabin was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the fragile, tentative presence of another heartbeat. Days bled one into the other, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist. This small, sparse room became the entire universe. Jedediah was a creature of routine. He tended his few cattle, mended his fences, and hunted for their food. But now his routine had a new center. Every action was bent toward the cot where the Apache girl lay. He would return from his chores and immediately check on her, his gruff exterior belying the anxious care in his eyes. He learned the rhythm of her fever, the moments it would spike and the blessed hours it would recede. He brewed bitter tea from willow bark, a remedy he had learned from a trapper long ago, and coaxed the unpleasant liquid past her lips. He made thin broth from rabbit and sat patiently, spooning it into her mouth when she was lucid enough to swallow. Nita drifted in and out of consciousness, her world a confused haze of pain, shadow, and the looming presence of the silent man who cared for her. At first, she saw him only as a threat. White man, the same as those who had destroyed her world. She would flinch when he came near, her eyes wide with a terror that was bone deep. But he never raised his voice. His hands, though rough, were always gentle. His silence was not menacing. It was watchful, patient. He would leave food and water by the cot and retreat to his chair, giving her space, allowing her to exist without demand. Slowly, the terror began to recede, replaced by a weary curiosity. She watched him through slitted eyes as he mended a piece of tack, his large hands surprisingly deft. She heard the quiet sigh he would let out late at night when he thought she was asleep, a sound so full of sorrow it resonated with her own. One afternoon, she awoke to find him asleep in his chair, his head slumped forward, the rifle loose in his lap. The harsh lines of his face were softened in sleep, and she saw not a monster, but a man burdened by a great weight. His shirt had a tear near the shoulder. With trembling fingers, she reached for a small sewing kit in her medicine pouch, which he had respectfully placed beside her bed. Her stitches were small and neat. When he awoke and saw the repair, he simply touched the spot, his fingers tracing her work, and looked at her. For the first time, their eyes met in shared understanding. That evening, as he gave her a bowl of broth, her voice, raspy from disuse, filled the silence. "Thank you," she whispered. The two words were a bridge across the chasm of their solitude. The bridge built by those two words was a fragile one, but it was a start. Nita's strength returned in small increments. Soon she was able to sit up, then to stand, leaning on the wall for support. The cabin, which had been her sickbed, now became her world to explore. She touched the smooth, worn wood of the table, the cold stone of the hearth. It was a simple place, a lonely place, but it was safe. The fortress of silence that Jedediah had built around himself began to crumble, not in a great collapse, but stone by painful stone. Their conversations were never long, but they were filled with a profound weight. They were two solitary souls sharing the fragments of their shattered lives. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, he spoke of his past. He did not look at her, but stared into the flames as if the story were written there. He spoke of a woman named Sarah, with hair the color of corn silk, and a little girl, Lily, who loved to chase butterflies. He spoke of the fever, the helplessness, the silence that came after. His voice was a low monotone, stripped of all emotion, yet the pain was a living thing in the small cabin. When he was done, a single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. Nita did not offer empty platitudes of comfort. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his forearm, a silent acknowledgement of his pain. A few nights later, it was her turn. She told him of her people, of the laughter in their camp, the wisdom of the elders, the joy of the changing woman's ceremony. And she told him of the attack, of the thunder, the smoke, and the cruelty. She spoke the name of the man who led it, a name that tasted like ash in her mouth. Silas Croft. At the sound of the name, Jedediah's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly hard and cold. He knew the name. Croft was a railroad man, a predator who bought up land with bribes and threats, a man whose greed was as vast and empty as the desert itself. He was rumored to want the land north of the river, the very land that had belonged to Nita's people. Suddenly, the danger was no longer a distant memory. It had a name and a face, and it was drawing nearer. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was threatened by the shadow of the man who had already taken so much. Jedediah looked at Nita, at the quiet strength that had returned to her eyes, and he knew he had made a choice the day he carried her to his home. He had chosen a side. His war was not over. It was just beginning. The shared knowledge of the threat forged a new bond between them, an unspoken alliance that went deeper than gratitude or pity. It was a bond of survival. The slow, quiet days took on a new purpose. Jedediah began to teach Nita to use a rifle. He took her out into the bright, clear morning, the vast emptiness of the landscape a stark backdrop for their lesson. He placed the heavy Winchester in her hands, his own hands covering hers, showing her how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel. "Don't think of who you're aiming at," he said, his voice low and steady. "Think of what you're protecting." His words were not just about the rifle, they were about everything. They were about the cabin, this small pocket of life they had carved out together. They were about the memory of his lost family and the ghosts of hers. Nita, who had only ever known weapons as instruments of her people's destruction, found a strange power in the cold, hard steel. She was a quick learner, her movements fluid and certain. She was not just a victim to be protected. She was becoming a defender of their shared home. Their relationship deepened in these quiet, purposeful moments. It was there in the way he would watch her tend to the small herb garden she had planted by the door, her presence bringing a touch of life and color to the barren yard. It was there in the way she would have a hot meal waiting for him when he returned, the cabin filled with the scent of roasted meat and herbs, a scent of home he had not known for years. The love between them was not a thing of grand declarations or passionate embraces. It was a slow-burn romance, built of shared chores, quiet companionship, and the steady, unwavering gaze that said, "I see you. You are not alone." One evening, she found him by the corral, staring out at the sunset that painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. She stood beside him, and for a long time they just watched the day die. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I thought I'd never see anything beautiful again." He turned to her, his face illuminated by the fading light. "I hadn't," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "Not until you." The admission hung in the air between them, more powerful than any kiss. They were no longer just a man and a woman. They were Jedediah and Nita, two halves of a whole, standing together against the encroaching darkness. The darkness came as they knew it would. It came on horseback in the form of a lone rider, a scout in the employ of Silas Croft. The man was tracking the last of the Apache who had escaped Croft's purge, a loose end the tyrant was obsessed with tying up. From a high ridge, the scout saw the impossible. A thin tendril of smoke rising from the chimney of the old stone place. He'd thought the man who lived there was half mad, a recluse who wanted nothing to do with the world. But smoke meant life, and life, in this territory Croft considered his own, was a thing to be investigated. He crept closer, using the terrain for cover, and through his spyglass he saw them. He saw Jedediah Stone, the haunted veteran, chopping wood with a steady, powerful rhythm. And then he saw her, the Apache girl. She was not a prisoner. She moved with a quiet confidence, hanging laundry on a line, her dark hair gleaming in the sun. The sight filled the scout with a cold, greedy excitement. He had found her. He rode back as if the devil himself were on his heels. The news, a valuable commodity he was eager to trade. Silas Croft received the report in his opulent, temporary office in the nearest railhead town. He was a man whose softness of body was belied by the utter cruelty in his eyes. He listened, his fingers steepled, a small, unpleasant smile playing on his lips. The girl had survived, and she had found a protector. The thought did not worry him. It enraged him. It was an affront to his power, a challenge to his will. He saw the girl not as a human being, but as the last living claim to the land he coveted. Her existence was a legal and spiritual complication he needed to erase. And the man Stone was now part of that complication. "He's a fool," Croft spat, his voice a low hiss, a broken-down soldier playing hero. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out over the dusty street as if he already owned it. "A fool who has made a fatal error. He has taken something that belongs to me." He turned back to his men, his eyes alight with a possessive fire. "Gather the men. 50 of them. I want every gun for hire from here to the territories. We're going to pay a visit to Mr. Stone. We will burn his little cabin to the ground and wipe this problem from the face of the earth." The order was given, and the gears of a terrible violence began to turn, aimed directly at the small, quiet sanctuary where two people had just begun to find peace. The sound came on the evening wind, a low, distant drumming that was not thunder. It was the sound of hoofbeats, many of them. Jedediah heard it first. He froze, his hand on the cabin door, his head cocked to the side. The peaceful quiet of their world was shattered in an instant. He looked at Nita, who was clearing their dinner plates, and she saw the grim certainty in his eyes. The time for peace was over. The war had come to their doorstep. "They're here," he said, his voice flat and hard. There was no panic, only a cold, deadly resolve. He moved with the swift efficiency of a soldier, barring the heavy door, shuttering the windows, leaving only small slits for firing. The cabin, their sanctuary of healing and love, transformed into a fortress. He checked his weapons, the Winchester, a spare rifle, and 2 heavy revolvers. He handed the second rifle to Nita. "Stay away from the door," he commanded. "Use the west window. Shoot at anything that moves. Aim true." She took the rifle, her knuckles white, but her gaze was steady. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective fire. She would not be a victim again. She would not watch another home be destroyed. She was fighting for more than her life now. She was fighting for the man who had given it back to her, for the future she had dared to imagine within these 4 walls. The drumming grew louder, a relentless wave of violence cresting on their small island of hope. Soon they could see them, a dark tide of riders silhouetted against the blood-red sunset. 50 men, a private army of cruelty, led by the tyrant Silas Croft, who sat on his fine horse, confident and arrogant. They surrounded the cabin, their shouted jeers and insults polluting the clean air. "Stone!" Croft's voice boomed, dripping with contempt. "Send out the savage. Give her to me, and I might let you live." Jedediah answered with a single shot from his Winchester. The bullet kicked up the dirt right in front of Croft's horse, making the animal rear in panic. It was his only answer. There would be no negotiation. There would be no surrender. The first wave of riders charged, their guns blazing, wood splintered from the cabin walls. The air filled with the roar of gunfire and the smell of cordite. Inside, Jedediah and Nita moved as one. He fired, reloaded, fired again, his movements economical and deadly. From her window, Nita aimed as he had taught her, her breathing steady, her focus absolute. She fired, and one of the riders cried out and fell from his saddle. A jolt went through her, the terrible finality of the act, but she did not waver. She was no longer the dying girl in the desert. She was a warrior defending her home. The battle raged as night fell, the muzzle flashes painting a hellish tableau of light and shadow against the cabin walls. The 50 hired guns were a relentless force, but Jedediah's cabin was a formidable bastion, and its 2 defenders fought with the ferocity of cornered wolves. They were outnumbered, but they were not outmatched in spirit. Jedediah was a master of defensive combat, making every bullet count, his years of military training roaring back to life. He moved from window to window, a whirlwind of deadly intent, his presence filling the small space, a bulwark against the tide of hate outside. But it was Nita who was the heart of their defense. She fought not with his cold efficiency, but with a burning, righteous fury. Every shot she fired was a cry for her lost family, a defiant roar against the man who had tried to erase her people. She was no longer just protecting a place. She was reclaiming her own power, her own will to live. Hours crawled by. The initial arrogance of Croft's men bled away, replaced by a grudging respect for the fight they were in, and then by frustration and anger. They had lost men, more than they had ever thought possible, to the 2 figures inside the small log fortress. The ground around the cabin was littered with the dark shapes of the fallen. But the assault was unending. Bullets tore through the walls, one grazing Jedediah's arm, another splintering the stock of Nita's rifle. They were running low on ammunition, and exhaustion was a leaden weight in their limbs. Silas Croft, watching from a safe distance, grew incandescent with rage. This was not the swift, brutal victory he had envisioned. This was an embarrassment. His authority was being challenged by a broken-down recluse and an Apache girl. His possessive obsession curdled into a personal vendetta. He would not just win, he would annihilate them. "Burn it!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fury. "Burn them out!" His men, needing no further encouragement, brought forward torches. The flickering orange light danced menacingly, promising a new kind of terror. In the cabin, Jedediah saw the approaching flames. He looked at Nita, his face grim in the dim light. "This is it," he said, his voice low. She met his gaze, her own eyes blazing. "We face it together," she replied. In that moment, a final, desperate plan was forged. Not a plan for survival, but a plan to make their stand count. They would not die choking on smoke. They would meet their enemy face to face. As the first torch arced through the air and landed on the dry roof of the porch, igniting with a hungry whoosh, Jedediah unbarred the door. The time for defense was over. He turned to Nita, his hand briefly touching her cheek. It was a farewell, a promise, and an apology all in one. "I am honored to have known you, Nita," he said, his voice raw. "My life began again with you," she whispered back, her hand covering his. Then, he threw the door open and charged into the night, roaring a challenge, his revolvers blazing. The sudden, suicidal attack took the hired guns by surprise. They had expected cowering victims, not avenging angels. Jedediah was a storm of motion, a specter of righteous vengeance cutting through their ranks. But he was just one man. While the bulk of the attackers focused on him, a smaller group, led by Silas Croft himself, rushed toward the now open cabin door. Croft's face was a mask of triumphant cruelty. He would claim his prize himself. He stepped over the threshold, his pistol raised, expecting to find the girl cowering in a corner. But Nita was not cowering. She stood in the center of the room, illuminated by the firelight from the burning roof. In her hands, she held not a rifle, but Jedediah's heavy hunting knife. Her face was serene, her eyes filled with an ancient, cold fire. She was the spirit of this land, the ghost of her people, and she would not be vanquished in this sacred place. Croft hesitated for a fraction of a second, taken aback by the sheer, defiant power radiating from her. That hesitation was his undoing. As he raised his pistol, she moved. She was not the frail woman he had pursued. She was a blur of motion, swift and silent as a panther. She knocked the gun from his hand with a powerful strike, the knife in her other hand flashing in the firelight. He stared in disbelief at the blade now pressed against his throat. "This land does not belong to you," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of generations of injustice. "You are nothing but a ghost here, and ghosts must fade." Outside, the gunfire faltered as the hired guns saw their leader held captive. Jedediah, wounded but standing, watched from the doorway. The choice, the end of the battle, rested with Nita. With a final, decisive movement, born not of vengeance but of a fierce and desperate need to protect her future, she ended the reign of the tyrant. The remaining mercenaries, their leader gone, their will broken, melted away into the darkness from which they had come. The silence that descended was more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence born of exhaustion, grief, and a fragile, unbelievable victory. The fire on the porch roof sputtered and died as a sudden, blessed rain began to fall, washing the blood from the dirt and the ash from the air. Jedediah and Nita stood in the doorway of their battered but standing cabin, looking out at the aftermath. They were wounded, bruised, and utterly spent, but they were alive, and they were together. The dawn that broke was the first morning of a new world. In the weeks and months that followed, they rebuilt. They repaired the bullet holes in the walls, mended the broken furniture, and cleared the scars of the battle from the land. But they were rebuilding more than just a cabin. They were rebuilding a life. The news of Silas Croft's fall spread through the territory. It traveled on the wind, a whisper of hope to the scattered remnants of Nita's people who were hiding in the mountains. One by one, then family by family, they began to emerge from the shadows, drawn to the story of the lone cabin that had stood against an army. They came seeking refuge, and they found a home. Jedediah's isolated ranch, once a monument to his solitude, became the heart of a thriving community. The silence was replaced by the sounds of children laughing, the rhythm of work, and the murmur of stories being told around a communal fire. A found family was born from the ashes of tragedy. Jedediah was no longer the stoic protector, haunted by ghosts. In teaching Nita to fight, he had taught himself to live again. In protecting her, he had found a new family to love. He became a leader, respected for his quiet strength and his deep well of honor. And Nita, no longer the resilient survivor, blossomed into her true self. She was a bridge between two worlds, a matriarch whose courage was the bedrock of their new community. She was a keeper of the old ways and a builder of the new. Standing on the porch of their cabin, now a home filled with life, she would watch him work with the people, his face no longer a mask of grief but open and filled with purpose. They had faced the worst of the world and had not only survived, but had created something beautiful in its wake. Their love, forged in fire and tempered by hardship, was the foundation of it all, a quiet, powerful testament to the enduring strength of the human heart. So we come to the end of our story, but is it truly an end? Or is it a beginning? We have walked with a man who believed his heart was a barren wasteland and a woman who had every reason to believe the world was made only of cruelty. We watched as a single act of kindness, the choice to help a stranger, became the first stone in the foundation of a fortress. That fortress was not made of logs and mud, but of trust, courage, and a love so profound it could turn back an army. Jedediah and Nita's story reminds us of a timeless truth, that our deepest wounds can become the source of our greatest strengths. Jedediah's grief did not break him. It hollowed out a space in his heart that only a love as powerful as Nita's could fill. Nita's loss did not crush her spirit. It ignited a fire that gave light to others. Their tale, set against the harsh beauty of the frontier, is a metaphor for the wilderness within us all. We all face our own deserts of loneliness, our own storms of sorrow. We all carry the ghosts of our past. But this story proves that we do not have to face them alone. It teaches us that true sanctuary is not a place you find, but a thing you build with another person. It is in the quiet moments of care, the shared burdens, the choice to stand together when the world tries to tear you apart. The greatest heroes are not always the ones who ride into battle with guns blazing, but sometimes they are the ones who have the courage to open a locked door to their home and to their heart. If the story of redemption, love, and the incredible power of the human spirit has moved you, please let us know by giving this video a like. And we want to hear from you in the comments below. What do you believe is the greatest act of courage a person can show? Is it facing down an enemy? Or is it learning to trust again after being broken? Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, stories that prove that even in the harshest of landscapes, hope can take root and blossom into something magnificent. Thank you for joining us on this journey.